This was only one of Vala's attacks on citadels of orthodoxy. He disputed the Stoic philosopher Boethius, and he revised the interpretations of scholastic philosophers by simplifying Aristotle's 9 categories into 3. He criticized the style of Cicero and demonstrated that Ad Herennium, the famous manual of rhetoric and memory commonly attributed to Cicero, was not by him at all. Characteristically, Vala went on to insist that the Apostles' Creed could not have been composed by the 12 apostles. After the Inquisition convicted him of heresy on 8 counts, among them his attempt to revise Aristotle, he would have been burned at the stake if his patron, King Alfonso, had not come to his rescue. Vala took the supreme risk by applying his new techniques of critical history to the Bible itself. He criticized St. Jerome's 4th century Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible that had served as the authorized version during the Middle Ages. And at the insistence of Cardinal Bessarion, who had given his great library to Venice, he even provided annotations on the New Testament, dangerous enough to be put on the Church's index of prohibited books. Vala's attack on the documentary foundations of papal supremacy still did not prevent the new Pope, Nicholas V, around 1397 to 1455, who was a generous patron of arts and letters, from appointing him a papal secretary. The Pope supported his historical writings and commissioned him to translate Herodotus and Thucydides. Vala delivered his final blast in 1457 when he was asked to offer the anniversary eulogy of St. Thomas Aquinas to the Dominicans at Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Before an astonished audience, he attacked St. Thomas for logic chopping and for his quote-unquote corrupt style, and pleaded for the simple theology of the Church Fathers. Vala's personal life was as unorthodox as his scholarship. Although he held numerous ecclesiastical posts, it is doubtful that he was ever ordained a priest. There is no record of his marriage, but he did have a Roman mistress by whom he fathered 3 children. It was not surprising that so unruly a character should open the Pandora's box of history. The printing press made his writings a time bomb. When finally printed, his annotations on the New Testament in 1505 and his attack on the donation of Constantine, 1517, the year when Luther posted his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, carried his explosive messages to a wide audience. Erasmus and others following his example brought history into the arsenal of the Reformation. The critical spirit also served all Christians in their battle against Islam. John of Segovia's translation of the Quran separated the earliest text from later Western editions. The sieving of the Quran in 1460 by the versatile Nicholas of Cusa, 1401 to 1464, analyzed the different historical elements that had gone into the sacred book to show that the surviving text was a product not of divine inspiration, but of human events. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, spawned countless controversies all over Europe between Catholic and Protestant princes claiming jurisdictions based on ancient documents. In France, the nobles, building legal cases for their local powers against the threats of an absolute king, engaged in what came to be called the diplomatic wars. The science of diplomatics, essential for modern historical sleuthing, developed in response to these needs. Diplomatics has very little to do with diplomacy, but derives from the Greek word diploma, meaning doubled or folded, used to describe documents that were usually folded. In ancient Rome, such important documents, when engraved on a bronze diptych, were folded shut and sealed, not only for convenience and storage, but to keep the contents secret. The term diploma was not much used in the Middle Ages, but Renaissance writers used it generally for an old document, especially one establishing property rights or political authority. Not until the 18th century was it used in English to mean an academic certificate. In 1607, an enterprising Dutch Jesuit, Heribert Rosvede of Utrecht, 1569 to 1629, drew up an ambitious plan to collect and publish the authentic narratives of the lives of the Christian saints. The latest techniques of philology and textual criticism would be used to separate truth from legend, to purify religious tradition, and make hagiography a science. The Jesuit fathers, who took their assignment seriously, horrified the devout in England when their researches dissolved the legend of St. George. One of these pioneers of critical history, the energetic Daniel Papebrink, 1628 to 1714, who produced 18 of these volumes, devised the rules for detecting forged documents, which he then applied to the Benedictine charters to prove that they were spurious. Papebrink asserted that there were no genuine charters surviving from any time before 700. If the Benedictine claims to the French monasteries of St. Denis and Corbie were proven invalid, these properties would probably belong to the Jesuits. The brilliant Jean Mabillon, 1632 to 1707, who had lately joined the Benedictines, was providentially qualified to defend his order and at the same time elaborate the techniques of modern textual criticism. Born into a peasant family in Champagne, he received the tonsure at the age of 19 and spent his early years traveling from monastery to monastery. At Saint Remy, he visited the church where kings of France were consecrated for centuries. And as he walked through the cemeteries where the earliest Christians of Gaul were burned, he became interested in the testimony of tombstones. During one of his investigations, he was so diligent that he was reported to be guilty of, quote, unpaving almost the entire church, end of quote. In reply to Papebrink, Mabillon wrote his De Re Diplomatica on the study of medieval charters, 1681 and 1704, which developed diplomatics into a subtle and comprehensive technique for authenticating old documents. The Jesuit Papebrink had cast suspicion on the Merovingian documents because of their peculiar lettering. In reply, Mabillon, for the Benedictines, explained that over the centuries, scripts had changed as much as the events they recorded. He illustrated Latin script from the capital letters of ancient Rome down to the handwriting of the 17th century. Surveying the whole range of clues, he opened the auxiliary sciences of handwriting, that's paleography, writing materials, seals, sphagistics, dates, that's chronology, and vocabulary, that's philology. Along with his principles for sifting historical evidence, he insisted quite sensibly that the genuineness of a document depended on the consistency of all the clues. Papebrink himself finally had to admit that Mabillon's principles were correct, and Mabillon's book became a classic for future historians. When Mabillon focused his criticism on the legends of popular saints, he risked prosecution. Near the end of his life, after he had undermined the genuineness of the supposed remains of saints in Rome, he had to be defended by Pope Clement XI himself. Even when threatened with the stigma of the index, he refused to give in with a substantial retraction, which would make him, for Lord Acton, quote, as an historian, eminently solid and trustworthy, as a critic, the first in the world, end of quote. Modern history grew not only in the negative mood, but also in positive enthusiasm. The rising glory of the Italian cities and a flourishing vernacular literature in Italian would provide secular subjects for epic narrative. The first modern national anthems were being written as history. Works about Florence and Italy opened a new chapter in the history of history. The burgeoning city-states engaged official historians to dramatize their struggle for greatness, to celebrate their men and women of virtue, and to point the direction of the future. Leonardo Bruni, 1368 to 1444, provided a history of the Florentine people, and Venice, 1476, which disentangled the story of the city from its legendary past. The greatness of Florence, he said, came from the Florentine Republic and its spirit of liberty. Rome, too, had flourished as a republic, and, quote, the Roman Imperium began to go to ruin when first the name of Caesar fell like a disaster upon the city, end of quote. The Roman Empire in the West had really ended with the barbarian invasions, for Charlemagne's empire was spurious, and the fortunes of the Italian cities rose again with their emergence as free republics. Flavio Biondo of Forli, 1392 to 1463, while celebrating Florence and Italy, provided a scheme that would dominate and tyrannize European historical thought for centuries to come. Separating the grandeur of antiquity from the promise of modern Italy, he made the 1,000 years after the seizure of Rome by Alaric into a single middle epic. Sometimes called the first medieval historian, Flavio Biondo might better be called the first self-consciously modern historian, for he seems to have been the inventor of the tripartite framework, ancient, medieval, and modern. Although he never himself actually used the phrase Middle Ages, medium aevum, it was he who gave a new historical coherence to the millennium after the fall of Rome. Western thought would never recover from his way of slicing the whole European past into a period of ancient glory and a period of modern rebirth, with a middle era of disintegration and decline in between. European historians preserved these imprisoning categories, which would even be exported to Asian historians, who recklessly referred to a quote-unquote medieval period in India or in China. One of these Florentine works of proto-modern history that continues to entertain and move us is The History of Florence and the Affairs of Italy by Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. Commissioned by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici in 1520 to write a history of Florence, Machiavelli drew raw materials from Bruni, Flavio Biondo, and others for the work he delivered in 1525 to his sponsor, who had become Pope Clement VII. The Prince, which Machiavelli had begun writing some years earlier, was a cameo of contemporary history cast in an unfamiliar mold. Machiavelli's history, following Bruni, gave half his work to the period from the barbarian invasions to the accession of the Medici in 1434. The rest recounted the intrigues and battles of Florentine Italy until the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492. Following Thucydides and Livy, Machiavelli wrote the speeches he thought appropriate to the characters and the occasions he recounted, and the rise and decline of the Florentine Republic, the corruption and ruthlessness of the Borgias, became a political tragedy that climaxed in his own day. His combination of the critical spirit and the epic form foreshadowed the great works of modern history. And this concludes Chapter 71. Have a wonderful day, and I will hopefully see you in Chapter 72.